Hello. So, today's a fun day. I was supposed to be getting through this early today, so I apologise if it's a little late going out. But the joy of life is that I've had a lot of teaching to do today. Mainly because I'm back and going and back and going. So things had to be sorted out at the university. But today we're talking about the raid on Makin Island, which took place 79 years ago today on nights of the 17th, 18th of August. Broadly speaking. Broadly speaking, it goes in at midnight on the 17th of August, and broadly speaking, they end up being finally recovered, most of them by 9 a.m. on the 18th of August, roughly. Well, and I put it by 11 p.m. at roughly on the 18th of August. It was an interesting collection. There is an interesting movie made about it. There's a lot of interesting things about Makin Island. There are a lot of interesting people involved in it. And honestly, if you're looking at it from an Atlantic side perspective, what I'm talking about compared to the command operations are a major feature of the Mediterranean, of the Northern European, and to an extent of the Southeast Asian and the Indian campaigns, where we talk about Chindits, we talk about SOE, we talk about commandos a lot. The raid on Makin, we don't talk about that much at all, really. And we don't talk about the Marine Force raiders that much at all. And I think it comes down to a very interesting perspective, which we'll get into when talking about the Marine Force raiders, because they have to deal with a lot of institutional weirdness. And I think the Marines still have this, the US Marines to this day. So, why Makin Island? Well, honestly, they wanted to do something. I'm not really sure what they wanted to do. It's always theoretically said it would be a good place to get intelligence. There is an admiral there, so Kosaab is sort of around there. And there's all sorts of things sort of around that area. But when they get there, well, the Japanese forces are led by a warrant officer. That's who's in charge there. Who dies? Kusaburo Kametsu, I think. Probably mispronounced that terribly. He's of the Special Naval Landing Force, and they are equipped with light weapons, so it really is Special Forces versus Special Forces in many regards. The Japanese conduct a lot of banzai charges, so we're getting into this. But the whole point of this thing was they were supposed to be taking prisoners. They were supposed to find Japanese equipment. They were supposed to therefore be getting intelligence. And the idea was also it would divert Japanese attention and reinforcements from the operations in Guadalcanal and Tulagi and that it would destroy the facilities that were there. Those were secondary, really. Intelligence was what its primary aim was. And there it is. You can see it on the map, and I'll expand it to full screen. Now, you can also see on the map several green icons which highlight various things I want to go and see in the world. One of them is Singapore, quite obviously. You can see that, but you can also from there work out where Guadalcanal and Tiligi is. There is also HMAS Vampire. Unsurprisingly, I want to go see her in Australia, but it tells you where Sydney is. Hawaii is highlighted because, again, I want to visit there. And there are various other things, including the USS Midway exhibit over the other side, that you can see America and where its major ports are. You can also quite clearly on that map make out Japan. So in the nicest way, Makin Island is kind of in the middle of nowhere. It is useful for three things. One of them is long-range flying boat reconnaissance from there, because it's a place they can set down and can be repaired and looked after. Two, it's so off the beaten track that if anyone really wants to take it, they have to get there for starters, take it and then hold it, and it's not really much use for the Americans. In that there are other places which are far more worth the resources to take. So for the Japanese, it can afford to be a small garrison. And free. Whilst it's well located for the Japanese to look at things, it's not really well located for the Japanese to support, but they don't care. It's a sacrificial lamb. And this has an impact on the operation. But also what has an impact on the operation is on who's going. The Marine Raiders. Now, the Marine Raiders, they're a special bunch. Honestly, even as they're being formed, there is a huge drive for many senior officers who do not like the idea of an elite force within an elite force. I can imagine those will be the same people who, when they see T-shirts which say things like, on the seventh day, God invented the Royal Navy because even the army need heroes, or things like that, get very furious and don't just giggle and go, there are jokes everywhere. Although, it's true, the army does need heroes, and that is the Royal Navy. Crete, Dunkirk, Narvik, Namsos. We can go on with the list. Every time the army gets stuck somewhere, it's usually the Navy who comes and drags them out of it. Anyway, leaving that to one side, usually also the Navy has also been the ones who dropped them off there in the first place, so, you can cast some blame here. They weren't liked. In fact, they were originally disbanded because, by a certain point, the United States Marines felt, no, every Marine is elite, every Marine should be able to do this, and da-da-da-da-da. And then they wondered why the US Navy formed the SEALs. The 1st Marine Raider Battalion are put under command of Lieutenant Colonel Edson. The 2nd Marine Raider Battalion are put under command of Lieutenant Colonel Carlson. Edson will go on to become, I think it's quite a senior general, if I remember correctly. He goes on to become a Major General and is known as Red Mike. He receives the Medal of Honor, 2 Navy Crosses, a Silver Star, and 2 Legions of Merit. He led the defense of Lunga Ridge during the Guadalcanal campaign. He served in France and Germany during World War One. And let's see, Carlson, sorry. I was talking about Edson. Well, Carlson goes on to the rank of Brigadier General. His awards are 3 Navy Crosses, the Legion of Merit, Purple Heart Medal twice, Combat Action Ridden, and the Croc al Merito di Guerra, or the War Merit Cross of Italy. Okay, these are not even your average US Marine officers. I have met many US Marine officers. I'm very proud to have lectured a fair number junior officers when they come to various programs at King's when I was doing my PhD. They are lovely people. But personally, I find the idea of there being an elite within elite quite an interesting one, because if you consider that's the model the Royal Navy followed for the Triber-class destroyers. They realised that the Royal Navy destroyer crews already considered themselves an elite. So you then gave them an elite to aspire to, an elite to look up to, so they had to hold themselves to an even higher standard, which raised the standard of the whole force. That was the part of the Royal Navy's doctrine with the Triber-class destroyers. However, you have people like Major General Thomas Halcombe. Basically oppose the idea of Marine commandos being created because the term Marine is sufficient to indicate a man ready for duty at any time, and the injection of special names such as commando would be undesirable and superfluous. He basically just turned the 1st Battalion 5th Marines into the 1st separate battalion, and under the command of Edson, and then creates a 2nd separate battalion under the command of Carlson, literally because he's president. He's being pressured by Roosevelt. I'm not sure what his idea was for small raiding actions. Perhaps his idea was that he would just use regular Marines. The thing is, whilst Chester Nimitz and Admiral Nimitz are requesting commander units for raids against lightly defended Japanese islands, there are lots of officers who are proposing against this because they're saying this is taking away from the route of march. And they do have a good point here, because actually taking the heavily defended islands requires the heavy troops. But then what happens is, as time goes on, the raids they're being used on are less and less. Basically, every time the Navy, and Nimitz especially, proposes raids, the Marines go, oh, no, we need maximum troops forever. So they end up using the raiders as conventional units, for which they are far too well trained and far too lightly armed. And eventually, this is used as the reason for getting rid of them, because they are, how do I put this? They are not able to do what a regular Marine battalion is supposed to do, because they're not designed to be a regular Marine battalion. It's like taking a squadron of the SAS or a squadron of US Navy SEALs and saying, right then, we're going to use them instead of a battalion of the Parachute Regiment or a battalion of modern US Marines. They're not the same forces. One is designed as a raiding force for a highly trained, highly tactical scenario which is dash in, dash out. One is designed to take and hold territory. Well, has the capability of it. Now, you'll notice I didn't use the SBS and the Royal Marines there. The reason I didn't use them, and you would think that would be the normal point, is, of course, the Royal Marines already transitioning to a commando force, and then there's the SBS. So in many ways, the Royal Marines are already the Marine Raiders, are heading towards that sort of area of system, and the SBS are the SEALs, US Navy SEALs. So at which point it becomes kind of complicated, okay? And that's if the British government really goes ahead with all the plans. So that's why I didn't include that. Pretty much the whole way through, it's the Navy asking for them. Mid-ranking officers, kind of like Donovan, Colonel William J. Donovan, the then Major Evans, Carlson, and Edson pushing for it, with the President's support, and general officers resisting heavily. There are differences in styles, and what I found is several books have pointed out this, that Carlson used egalitarian and team-building methods that apparently he'd learned working with various factions in China. Now, treating officers and enlisted men with, how to put it, a lot of respect and a lot of work. Carlson, how do I put this, is in many ways, it's kind of interesting. There are various sources put about where he's getting this from. Some put it down as the factions in China he's worked with and communist units, especially. Some put it down, and one interesting put it down, says he's reading the manuals that the British commandos are sending across, because the British commandos are working on that sort of style, especially because whilst officers have the authority, yes, they might not have the technical skill or capability of the NCOs. So you run, because you're running a far more fluid and dynamic fighting profile, you run a far less rigid command structure. And you allow NCOs basically the license in their area of technicality to go tell the officers to shut up. It works quite well sometimes. Edson's battalion, that's the 1st Marine, are very much more, well, how do I put this? In their structure and form, they're formed very much more along the traditional Marine lines. In their operational doctrine, they're more free-flowing than they look. But they are formed up, which is important for the US Marines, because they look more like US Marines. Well, for the general officers. Carlson's unit, that's the 2nd Marine Raiders, and that's the one which is important for this, because they're the ones used on route, are organised into a different organisation. He organises it around 6 rifle companies, each made of 2 platoons, each made up of 3-man fire teams as their basic unit. In many ways, and this is going to upset some people, Carlson's formation is far more modern than what the US Marines originally had. I don't know. And before we get into it, they do have a very cool badge. That's a cool badge. Honestly, I have been trying to figure out where the insignia comes from, and I've read about 5 different texts from books and digital books I've downloaded, and they all have different perspectives on it. I do like that now Marine Special Operations Regiment has been reorganized as the Marine Raider Regiment. And it's basically the MARSOC unit has become the Raiders again. But to be honest, there's part of me which is sitting there going, you're sort of co-opting history when you've spent years denying it, which I find a bit cheeky, let's say. Anyway, so our main topics of discussion today come with the good old Carson and his troops, who were put in a pair of submarines. So the raid. It's one of the first air offensive ground operations of World War II for the Americans, and pretty much 2 of this battalion, 6 companies, and roughly half of the battalion's command group, it seems, are inserted. That's because of the space limitations aboard the 2 submarines, Argonaut and Nautilus. 121 troops were able to be embarked aboard Argonaut, and the rest were embarked upon Nautilus. Now, Argonaut is, of course, one of the V-boats. She's actually V4. And Nautilus is V6. Basically, the V-boats are the US Navy trying to build long-range, large submarines. They're quite a successful basis of an idea. They are Barracuda, Bass, Bonita, Argonaut, Narwhal, Nautilus, Dolphin, Catalot, and Cuttlefish. Interesting enough, Argonaut and Nautilus are both part of the same batch. That's the second batch of them. So they're as similar as they can be. Now, the Imperial Japanese Navy had created the Makin Atoll garrison in 1942, part of the Marshall Islands garrison, and theoretically, as said before, it's 71 armed personnel led by a warrant officer. There are also some members of the Seaplane Tender Base and a meteorological unit, and 2 civilian personnel attached to Japanese forces, interpreters and civilian administrators for various duties. Now, on the 17th, after a basically uneventful journey, on the 17th of August 1942, at midnight, the Marine Raiders were launched in their little rubber boats. Now, these are known as the LCRLs, and they're sort of an inflatable boat, which are powered by 6 horsepower outboard motors. Those motors do like to break down a lot. The landing is pretty difficult. There are rough seas, there's high surf. As I said, the outboard motors keep liking to fail. And then things start to go really weird, because Carlson decides to land all his men on one beach. However, he doesn't manage to tell all his personnel this. And so at 05:15, Lieutenant Oscar Petros, another officer who will go on to be very highly decorated and a Major General, and his 12-person man squad, land on Makin, on their original beach. They were supposed to. They're the only ones who land on that beach. Carlson and the rest of them have gone to the other beach. So Automatically now you have 199 troops on one beach and 12 on the other. I don't know about you, but if I was those 12, I'd be going, what is it? Do I smell? But they are US Marines, and not only that, they are Marine Raiders, so they carry on. And they head inland. At 0700 hours, with Company A leading, the Raiders advance from the beach across the island to its north shore, and then from the north shore attack in a southwesterly direction, broadly speaking. Their initial resistance is Japanese snipers and machine guns that start to stall the advance slowly. They slowly build up and inflict casualties. The Japanese are actually winning the fight until they decide to launch some banzai charges, which get wiped out. Not sure. I think the Japanese felt they were facing a far larger force than they actually were. So they thought they were surrounded and they were going down with honor, when actually, probably if they just hung on with their machine guns and the snipering, they could have killed most, if not the vast majority of the US Marines. Starting to see a small issue here in terms of intelligence gathering and coordination. Okay. These two charges, though, are wiped out by the Raiders because they get to hold the defensive. There isn't really much cover, so if you're maneuvering, you've got no protection. But what cover there is on Makin Island benefits the person who's on the defensive. At 0900 hours, Lieutenant Petrus and his 12 men appear behind the Japanese, who were fighting the rest of the Raiders to the east. At which point, Petrus's units kill 8 of the Japanese and Sergeant Major Kanmetsu, the warrant officer in charge of them. Knock out a machine gun and destroy the enemy raiders. They suffer 3 dead and 2 wounded. They still failed to manage to contact Carlson, but so they withdraw with their wounded to the subs at dusk as planned. And their boat works, okay? Their boat works. So this is the great thing. They have arrived, saved the rest of their unit, probably, or at least made it far more reduced casualties, even though they've lost them themselves. Still not managed to get in contact with Carlson, because not sure what's going on between the two units. And they basically go, right then, timing, we've got a bug out, I'm getting my troops out, we're going. Petrus? Great. So far, Petrus, textbook commando officer here. Brilliant. At 1:30, please note that time, so that's 4.5 hours later, 12 Japanese planes, including 2 flying boats, arrived over Makin. These flying boats, were carrying reinforcements for the garrison, and they attempted to land in the lagoon, but they met with machine gun, rifle, and boys' anti-tank rifle fire from the raiders. So again, you were supposed to be withdrawing to your submarines at 0900 hours. 4.5 hours later, you're still on the island. One plane crashes, the other bursts into flames. The remaining aircraft decide to bomb and strafe, but they don't inflict any American casualties. At 7:30 hours, Carlson begins to withdraw. So this is 10.5 hours after Petrus and his men withdrew, because that was the original timetabling and scheduling. They try using their 18 rubber boats. Unfortunately, many of these vessels no longer had working outboard motors, and only 7 boats with 93 men make it to the subs. The next morning, Several more boatloads of raiders were able to fight the surf and reach the sub, but 72 men, along with only 3 remaining rubber boats, so that shows you how many are damaged and not working, were still on the island. At 11:30, that's 23:30 hours, on how do I put this? At 23:30 hours, they try again, and it fails again. In fact, 11 of the 18 boats were unable to breach the strong surf. They go back, and they try again, as said in the morning. And several boats managed to reach it, but there are still 3 boats, so 8 managed to reach it, and 72 men back at the thing, back on the island. Sorry, my notes were a bit disorganized there. At this point, Carlson dispatches a note to the Japanese commander offering to surrender. The Japanese messenger, though, was killed by other Marines who were unaware of Carlson's plan. There's a theme turning up here of people being unaware of Carlson's plan. He's an officer I have great respect for. This operation, he does seem to be not perhaps incompetent people. At 0900 hours on the 18th of August, the subs managed to send a rescue boat to stretch rope from the ships to the shore, from them to shore. From the boats to shore. Submarines are called, of course, boats, but if we call them boats in this one, it's going to get confusing with rowboats. So we're going to call the submarine ships, as I think also they did on the Wikipedia, just to make it less confusing. But I do know submarines are boats. Please, I'm just trying to not get you confused with the raiders' boats. That managed to allow. The idea was the line would allow the remaining raiders' boat to be pulled out to sea. Then more Japanese planes arrive and sink the rescue boat, attack the subs but miss. The subs crash dive. And at 23:08 hours, they were signalled again. This is on the 18th of August, to meet the raiders at the entrance to Makin Lagoon. Carlson and his team, led by a Lieutenant Charlie Lamb, built a raft made up of the 3 rowboats and 2 native canoes, which they'd found, powered by the 2 remaining outboard motors, which I'm hoping were attached to native canoes, and managed to get the 72 exhausted raiders to the Naval Lagoon, where the subs pick them up. USMC casualties were given as 18 killed in action and 12 missing in action. Of 12, 1 was later identified amongst the 19 Marine Corps graves found on Makin Island. 9 were inadvertently left behind or returned to the island during the night withdrawal. No one's quite sure. They're subsequently captured, moved to Kwajin Atoll, and executed on the orders of Koso Abe. That's the admiral in charge of the area. The remaining 2 Marines have never been accounted for. Carlson claims that he has personally encountered 83 Japanese bodies and estimated that 160 Japanese were killed based on reports from the Makin Island natives with whom he spoke. In fact, Morrison states that 60 Japanese were killed by the sinking of one of the boats. However, Japanese records are slightly more precise on this one. And the entire garrison casualties were listed as 46 killed of all ranks, although they don't list the casualties for the boats sunk, or the flying boats which were sunk, and the small boats which were sunk. But it's doubtful they had hundreds of crew aboard. The flying boats are big, but not hundreds. And in fact, when Japanese forces returned to the island, they found 27 of their personnel still alive and fine on the island, going, So the raiders were there for 2 days and didn't find everyone there. They could have actually found some people to take prisoner. There were 27 of them wandering around. So, the aftermath. Well, there has been a movie, there has been a book. The movie was Gung Ho, and all sorts of things done based on this. Right? There were a lot of wounded Marines brought back very successfully. My only point, and I make this with all due respect, the whole way through the accounts I've read, and I've been trying to read a few because I didn't want to be unfair, because I'm far more familiar with the commando operations in the Mediterranean by the SBS, with the commandos and their operations in Norway, etc., than I am with American commando raids, or, as this case, Marine Raiders operations in the Pacific. Carlson and Edson have the right idea, but I don't think they have the right structures. When you consider the operations which the British especially do, which supposedly the British commandos are the inspiration behind this, from Roosevelt's perspective, the sheer amount of intelligence which is gathered beforehand, and I know with the scenario of the Pacific Islands, you can't gather intelligence by having SOE agents wander over the place. You can't necessarily do a fast flyby with an aircraft because you don't necessarily have a recon aircraft in range, or even a fast motor torpedo boat flyby, or rather sailby. But a little bit of intelligence would have gone a long, long way in making this raid far more successful. And I'm not talking intelligence as in the Japanese numbers. I'm talking geographical intelligence. Stuff which could have been picked up. Stuff which should have been sort of worked out before they went in. For example, you've got your submarines off the shore. You're making your decision as to go whether you want 2 beaches or 1. That should have been made before the boats headed out, so the message could be clearly communicated to your teams. It shouldn't be made on the way in. It should have been made beforehand. You should have been studying the surf as you got there, taking situational intelligence, not waited till you were going in to make that decision. It turns out to be very useful, which suggests that actually perhaps landing in 2 places as originally planned would have been the better scenario. It might have been more tough to actually accomplish, but it might well have been a better scenario from a casualty perspective, as it would have presented the Japanese with a far greater problem, considering what Petros and his team managed to achieve. Secondly, Carlson is offering to surrender, which suggests he knows there are Japanese personnel still alive. There are 27 of them. That's not that many. He is supposed to be taking prisoners. He is presumably trapped there by his own inability to get off through the surf. He presumably has ammunition and weapons. Don't take this the wrong way, America, but Makin Atoll is not the largest place in the world. You know, There are various very nice native people who might well help you out. They might not. But either way, it seems like a wasted opportunity. It really does. And they could have achieved far, far more. But that's the way life goes. The fact is, though, they did demonstrate it worked, and then they don't get used so much. And here's the really interesting thing, because if you consider how commandos get used and how much reconnaissance they end up doing for things like D-Day and various Operation Torch and those sort of things, because the commander units themselves spawn some elite units which can do reconnaissance for amphibious operations, they could have been really, really useful as the Pacific War went on, the Marine Raiding Force, to spawn such units. They don't. They don't get used properly. They don't get supported properly, and they aren't functioning it through properly. And I think it ultimately comes down to this thing that they wanted a raiding force, and I think in the end, that's thanks to Nimitz and Roosevelt, they get a raiding force. But the US Marines are very worried about another unit being seen as more elite than regular Marines, and that all Marines are as good as each other, they're all amazing. And I think it gets back to the fact of you can be swept up too much with the idea of it being all amazing. I think it comes back to US Marines are amazing at being Marines, but they need some specialists in various roles. And I feel that in a way, the Raiders should have been treated as specialists rather than necessarily as an elite within elite. They might, the US Marines might have, in World War II, might have understood that better rather than seeing them being portrayed, especially when Roosevelt's talking about them as an elite within elite. No, they're specialized. They specialize in raiding, so that the rest of you don't have to. You know, they can live aboard a submarine for weeks at a time, all those sort of things, which you guys don't want to. That's, again, sort of the argument that makes the Marines accept them, but also if they'd kept to that sort of role of them being specialist Marines rather than elite Marines, they might not have been committed so often to regular duties and soft in comparison to regular Marine battalions. Because they would have realised they would have said, right, and these are specialists for when there's a special operation. Kind of like you have the Marine Corps Armour, or the Marine Corps the Air Wing, and all the other things are part of the Marine Corps. These would have been the specialists. Anyway, I hope that's been of interest to you, and I hope Makin Island you go and have a look up. So, what do we have coming this week? We have on 19th, Patron 30, Andronor, Japanese hybrid warships of World War II. Worth building or a waste of resources? Well, as that's coming up, and as people keep asking me for teasers, there is going to be on the 19th of August also a Japanese hybrid introduction, which is going to come out earlier in the day. There's also going to become a little bit of a profile on the story of procurement for Battle of Atlantic escorts. It's going to come out tomorrow. And the reason I'm doing that is because there is a very interesting person who's very interested in naval history, I think, who keeps commenting on the various Battle Atlantic stuff. No, the Royal Navy wasn't preparing, they weren't, things, not saying this, but basically things along the line, no, the Royal Navy wasn't preparing, there were unescorted convoys, which there weren't in the threat areas. There are unescorted convoys, but they have something. They don't often have everything. And also, basically, that the Royal Navy wasn't prepared and they weren't thinking about the Battle Atlantic, and they were just forced to do a crash program. And I'm going to go into the story of the escort procurement because Honestly, they are. The trouble is they're preparing for a war. When you consider the 10-year rule ends in 1932, they're preparing for a war roughly in 1942, 1941-42, and it happens in 1939. And these things aren't quick, but I'll be getting into that. Anyway, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.